My name is Maya Thorne. I am 28 years old. 3 months ago, my parents looked me straight in the eye and handed me the keys to a house that was literally falling apart. It had cracked walls, rotting floors, and absolutely no running water. Meanwhile, my twin sister, Genevieve, was given a brand new luxury apartment in the heart of downtown. I did not argue. I simply took those rusty keys, drove 40 minutes out into the country, and I rebuilt that ruin with my own 2 hands. Every single nail, every board, and every coat of paint was my doing. I poured $12,000 and 400 hours of sweat into that project. When my mother finally saw the masterpiece I had created, she did not say she was proud. Instead, she looked around with a cold expression and told me that they were taking the house back. She said it belonged to my sister now, and that I had exactly 48 hours to leave. But when Genevieve arrived with her moving boxes, the color drained from her face because of a secret they never expected. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly speaks to you. Now, let me take you back to a Friday evening in March. It started at my parents' dining table, the same mahogany table where every important family announcement has been made since I was 6 years old. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression grave as he clutched 2 envelopes. Genevieve was glowing, already knowing her envelope contained the deed to her downtown dream. When he handed me mine, the weight of the metal keys inside felt like a heavy insult before I even opened it. My father cleared his throat, a dry and heavy sound that always signaled a lecture was coming. "Maya," he began, looking at me with a rehearsed kindness, "you have always been the sensible one, the daughter who understands the value of hard work and patience. We want to ensure that both of our daughters are set up for their futures, but in ways that suit their unique personalities." He pushed the first envelope toward Genevieve, whose eyes were already shimmering with greed and excitement. Inside was the deed to a brand new luxury apartment in the prestigious Heights district, a place with a 24-hour concierge, a rooftop pool, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Then, he turned to me and pushed the second, much lighter envelope across the mahogany table. "Maya, this is the old family property out in Clear Creek. It has been sitting vacant for over 20 years, and it needs someone with your specific grit to bring it back to life." He called it an investment in my character, but as I pulled out the heavy rusted keys, I knew exactly what it was. It was a dumping ground. Genevieve did not even try to hide her smirk as she looked at the glossy brochures of her modern Italian kitchen. She told me that maybe I could turn my ruin into a cute little rustic getaway, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that always felt like a sharp slap in the face. My mother patted my hand and said that I should be grateful to have any roof over my head in this difficult economy. I looked at the cold, rusted metal in my palm and realized that they were not just giving me a house. They were giving me a clear message. They were telling me that Genevieve deserved the absolute best the world could offer, while I was only worth what everyone else had discarded and forgotten. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply closed my hand around those keys, feeling the cold iron bite into my skin, and I decided right then that I would show them exactly what I could do with their trash. My father cleared his throat, a dry and heavy sound that always signaled a lecture was coming. "Maya," he began, looking at me with a rehearsed kindness, "you have always been the sensible one, the daughter who understands the value of hard work and patience. We want to ensure that both of our daughters are set up for their futures, but in ways that suit their unique personalities." He pushed the first envelope toward Genevieve, whose eyes were already shimmering with greed and excitement. Inside was the deed to a brand new luxury apartment in the prestigious Heights district, a place with a 24-hour concierge, a rooftop pool, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Then, he turned to me and pushed the second, much lighter envelope across the mahogany table. Maya, this is the old family property out in Clear Creek. It has been sitting vacant for over 20 years, and it needs someone with your specific grit to bring it back to life. He called it an investment in my character, but as I pulled out the heavy, rusted keys, I knew exactly what it was. It was a dumping ground. Genevieve did not even try to hide her smirk as she looked at the glossy brochures of her modern Italian kitchen. She told me that maybe I could turn my ruin into a cute little rustic getaway. Her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that always felt like a sharp slap in the face. My mother patted my hand and said that I should be grateful to have any roof over my head in this difficult economy. I looked at the cold, rusted metal in my palm and realized that they were not just giving me a house. They were giving me a clear message. They were telling me that Genevieve deserved the absolute best the world could offer, while I was only worth what everyone else had discarded and forgotten. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply closed my hand around those keys, feeling the cold iron bite into my skin. And I decided right then that I would show them exactly what I could do with their trash. The smell of mildew and forgotten memories was thick as I moved through the living room. Every floorboard beneath my feet groaning as if it were holding onto a secret from 20 years ago. I reached out to touch the wallpaper, and it peeled away in a single brittle sheet, revealing the gray, crumbling plaster behind it that looked like a map of a broken country. My father had called this a gift. But as I walked into the kitchen and saw the rusted pipes and the shattered remains of an old porcelain sink, I knew it was a test designed to make me fail. He wanted to see if I would break under the weight of this ruin, and he wanted to see if I would crawl back to the mahogany table to beg for a small piece of Genevieve's luxury. I pulled a small notebook from my back pocket and began to list the casualties of time, realizing the roof alone would need at least $10,000 in urgent repairs. The plumbing was a complete disaster, and the electrical wiring looked like a bird's nest of fire hazards waiting for a single spark. I spent 4 hours just measuring the rooms, my hands getting stained with the black dust of decades of neglect and loneliness. While I was standing in the middle of the master bedroom, my phone buzzed with a photo from Genevieve, showing her on her new balcony with a glass of champagne. The city lights of downtown were sparkling like diamonds behind her, and her caption said that she was so sorry about my dusty project. I deleted the message immediately, because I did not have time for her petty games or her fake pity. I had 400 hours of labor ahead of me and $12,000 in my savings account that I had been protecting for a moment. Exactly like this. I looked at the dark corners of the room and realized that if I could fix this house, I could finally fix the parts of myself that my family had tried so hard to ruin. The first week of April was a blur of gray dust, stinging sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of ancient nails being pried from rotting wood. I decided to start with the kitchen, because the scent of wood, rot, and stagnant water there was so overwhelming that it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest every time I crossed the threshold. I wore heavy industrial work gloves and a thick filtration mask, but by noon, my lungs still felt heavy, and every single muscle in my body was screaming in protest of the sudden violent activity. I spent 48 hours just clearing out the mountains of trash that had been left behind by the previous tenants, including old mattresses that smelled of damp earth and ancient newspapers that crumbled like ash the moment I touched them. I filled 20 large industrial trash bags to the point of bursting, hauling each one down those sagging front porch steps while the Millers watched from across the street. I could feel their eyes on me, heavy with a judgment they did not even try to hide, as if they were counting down the minutes until I would finally throw down my hammer and drive away forever. But every time my back ached or my hands shook with pure exhaustion, I thought about the cold mahogany table and the way Genevieve had looked at her luxury brochure with that entitled smirk. I realized that every bag of heavy trash I hauled away was a piece of the miserable life my parents had chosen for me that I was actively refusing to accept. By Wednesday evening, the kitchen was a hollow shell of wooden studs and subflooring, and for the first time in 20 years, the house felt like it could finally breathe again. I stood in the middle of the debris, my hair covered in gray plaster dust, and my skin streaked with grime, and I felt a strange, quiet sense of power rising within me. This was no longer just a ruin. It was the beginning of my own empire. May bled into June, and the temperature inside the house climbed to a stifling 95 degrees. I spent 3 grueling weeks crawling through the dark, damp crawl space beneath the living room, replacing the ancient, rusted iron pipes with modern copper. My hands were constantly cramped from the tight spaces, and the sharp, metallic smell of sulfur and old dirt seemed to have stained my very soul. One Tuesday afternoon, my father called. He did not ask how I was feeling, or if I needed so much as a bottle of cold water. Instead, he wanted to know if I had found any vintage furniture in the ruins that Genevieve could use for her new balcony. He told me that she was hosting a lavish housewarming party for her prestigious colleagues from the law firm, and that every detail needed to be absolutely perfect. I held the phone with a grease-stained hand and listened to him talk about the expensive fabric of Genevieve's new curtains, while I sat on a dirt floor surrounded by cobwebs and shadows. I told him there was nothing left here but dust and rot. He sighed, a sound of profound disappointment, and told me that I was being difficult and selfish again. That evening, I sat on the sagging porch and watched the fireflies dance in the tall grass. The silence of Clear Creek was absolute, a heavy contrast to the noise and bright lights of the city where my sister was being celebrated. I realized that my parents had not just given me a house. They had provided me with an exile. They had placed me far enough away so that my struggle would not ruin the view of Genevieve's perfect success. But as I drank lukewarm water from a plastic jug, I felt a strange sense of freedom. In the city, I was the disappointing daughter. Out here, under the vast and indifferent stars, I was a creator. I was the person who was making something out of nothing. And for the first time in 28 years, I did not care if they were watching or not. July arrived with a heat that felt like a physical presence, heavy and unrelenting against the old wooden frame of the house. I turned my attention to the walls of the master bedroom, stripping away layers of floral wallpaper that had turned brown and brittle with age. Behind the paper, I found handwritten notes on the plaster, dates from the 1950s marking the growth of children I would never know. It felt like I was excavating a forgotten history while building my own. I sanded the original oak floors until my shoulders felt like they were made of lead. But when the natural grain of the wood finally emerged from under 40 years of grime, it was beautiful. I spent $3,400 on high-quality paints and finishes, choosing soft whites and warm wood tones that made the rooms feel larger and filled with light. Every evening, I would sit on the floor, surrounded by cans of varnish and rolls of tape, eating a cold sandwich and planning the next day's battle. My hands were calloused and my fingernails were perpetually stained with wood stain, a stark contrast to Genevieve's perfectly manicured fingers. She called me once that month, her voice buzzing through the speaker of my phone as I was trying to fix a leak in the attic. She told me that she was bored with her luxury apartment already and was thinking of redecorating in a bohemian style. She asked if I could come over and help her move some heavy furniture because she did not want to pay for professional movers. I told her I was busy building a life, and the silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. I was no longer the sister who dropped everything to cater to her whims. I was Maya Thorne, and I was busy making a masterpiece out of a memory. August brought a subtle change in the air, a hint of autumn that made the grueling outdoor work slightly more bearable. I turned my focus to the exterior of the house, determined to strip away the gray weathered layers of the past. I spent $750 on high-quality exterior paint, choosing a classic, crisp white that seemed to glow under the afternoon sun. Every time I climbed the tall ladder, my heart would race with a mixture of fear and excitement. But I kept going, stroke by stroke, until the skeleton of the house began to look like a home again. I spent another $400 on native plants and flowers, spending my evenings digging into the stubborn, dry earth to create a garden that felt wild and welcoming. One Saturday afternoon, Mr. Miller, who had watched me with silent doubt for months, finally walked across the road with a cold glass of lemonade. He stood there for a long time, just looking at the transformation, before he told me that he had not seen the old Thorne property look so alive in over 30 years. He said that my grandmother would have been proud to see what I had done. And for the first time, I felt a lump in my throat that was not caused by dust or exhaustion. It was the realization that I was not just fixing a building, I was reclaiming a legacy that my parents had tried to discard. While Genevieve was busy showing off her mass-produced furniture to people who did not truly care about her, I was building a sanctuary with my own sweat and blood. I looked at my calloused palms and realized that I no longer needed their approval to know my own value. September arrived with a crisp breeze that rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, and for the first time, the house felt completely alive. I had poured $12,000 of my hard-earned savings and exactly 400 hours of back-breaking labor into every single corner of this sanctuary. The walls were smooth, the floors were gleaming, and the garden was blooming with the vibrant colors of my own resilience. I was standing on the porch, admiring the crisp white paint that glowed in the twilight, when I saw my mother's expensive black car turn into the gravel driveway. She did not call ahead, and she certainly did not bring a housewarming gift. She stepped out of the vehicle, her eyes narrowing as she took in the stunning transformation of the ruin she had once mocked so cruelly. She walked through the front door without waiting to be invited, her designer heels clicking like a cold countdown on the floors I had sanded until my fingers bled. She touched the marble countertop in the kitchen and examined the custom shelving in the living room with a look of predatory satisfaction. "Maya," she said, her voice smooth and completely devoid of any maternal warmth, "you have truly exceeded our expectations. We never thought you could actually make this place habitable, let alone beautiful." My heart leaped for a fleeting second, thinking she was finally proud of me. But then she continued explaining that Genevieve was having terrible trouble with her downtown apartment due to a loud construction project and a sudden plumbing failure. She told me that the family had discussed the matter, and they decided that Genevieve would be moving in here immediately. She looked me straight in the eye and said that I had exactly 48 hours to remove my belongings, because this house was always meant to be a family asset, and Genevieve needed it more than I did. It was not a request. It was a cold eviction from my own heart. I stood there in the kitchen, the sunlight reflecting off the marble countertops I had installed with my own shaking hands, and I felt a coldness spread through my veins that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. 48 hours, I whispered, the words feeling like jagged glass in my throat. I asked my mother if she understood what she was saying, if she realized that I had poured $12,000 and 400 hours of my life into this ruin, while she and my father were busy praising Genevieve's luxury lifestyle. She just waved her hand dismissively, as if my labor was nothing more than a minor hobby, and told me that family members do not keep track of such petty debts. She said that since the house originally belonged to the family estate, it was their right to decide its best use, and right now, Genevieve's comfort was the priority. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 28 years, the veil of daughterly loyalty fell away. I saw a woman who was willing to strip me of my shelter and my dignity just to soothe the minor inconveniences of her favorite child. My mother told me that I should be happy to help my sister, that Genevieve was struggling with the noise of the city and needed the peace of Clear Creek to recover her spirits. I did not argue. I did not beg. Instead, I felt a strange, sharp clarity settle over me. I remembered the old metal box I had found hidden under a loose floorboard in the attic during the second month of renovations. I remembered the yellowed paper with the official state seal that my father had clearly forgotten existed. As my mother walked back to her car, shouting over her shoulder about the cleaning standards she expected for Genevieve's arrival, I simply nodded. I told her that I understood the situation perfectly, but what I was thinking was that they had no idea who actually owned the ground they were standing on. The 48 hours passed in a blur of cold determination and legal research. I did not spend my time packing the beautiful curtains or the hand-sanded furniture that now graced every room of the house. Instead, I spent every waking minute in the attic, carefully organizing the documents I had found in the old steel box, making sure every signature was authenticated and every seal was visible. By the time the sun began to rise on the third day, a massive yellow moving truck was already rumbling down the quiet gravel road of Clear Creek. Genevieve arrived shortly after in her pristine white convertible, looking like she was visiting a country estate rather than a home she had just stolen from her own sister. She stepped onto the porch with a sense of entitlement that made my blood run cold. Already pointing out parts of the garden she wanted the movers to dig up and replace with modern sculptures. She did not even look at me as she walked through the front door, complaining about the faint scent of varnish and the lack of a proper security system. She told the movers to start bringing in her designer leather sofas and to be careful with the Italian marble lamps. I stood in the corner of the kitchen, watching the chaos with a calm that I did not know I possessed. When Genevieve finally noticed me and asked why I was not packed and ready to go, I simply held up a glass of water and told her to take a seat. I said that we needed to have a very important conversation about the definition of ownership before she spent another $1 on decorations. The confusion on her face was almost as satisfying as the weight of the trust deed in my pocket. Genevieve laughed, a sharp and jagged sound that echoed through the newly painted hallways of my sanctuary. She told me that I was being delusional, and that our father had given her the keys himself, which made her the rightful mistress of the entire property. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to the kitchen island and laid out the yellowed, brittle document I had recovered from the hidden steel box in the attic. It was the original trust deed from 1992, signed by our grandmother, Maya Thorne. Genevieve reached for it with her perfectly manicured hand, but I pulled it back just out of her reach. I told her to look closely at the signature and the specific legal clauses regarding the inheritance of the Clear Creek land. Our parents had lived with the assumption that the property was a family asset they controlled, but they had forgotten, or perhaps they never chose to read, the fine print of our grandmother's will. The land was held in a private trust specifically for the first grandchild who reached the age of 25 while maintaining a steady career. Our parents had never technically owned this soil. They were merely the temporary caretakers until the trust was activated. I turned the page to show her the final confirmation from the county clerk's office, dated 3 weeks ago. Genevieve's face turned a ghostly shade of gray, her eyes darting across the legal language as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was not the owner of a country estate. She was a trespasser in a home that belonged entirely to the sister she had spent her whole life looking down upon. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and began to scream into the receiver, demanding that our mother come to the house immediately to fix this impossible mistake. I stood there, calm and resolute, watching the movers freeze in the doorway as they realized the woman paying them had no right to be there. My mother's car screeched into the driveway. Less than 20 minutes later, the sound of gravel spraying against the side of the house like a barrage of tiny bullets. She did not even wait for the engine to stop before she was out of the vehicle and storming up the porch steps, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She ignored me entirely, rushing straight to Genevieve, who was sitting on her expensive Italian leather suitcase, sobbing into her hands as if the entire world had collapsed around her. When my mother finally turned to me, her voice was a sharp, jagged edge that seemed to cut through the quiet afternoon air. She demanded to know what kind of sick, cruel game I was playing by upsetting my sister with fake documents and lies about a property that clearly belonged to the family estate. I did not flinch, and I did not look away. I calmly handed her the second copy of the trust deed, the one with the official embossed seal from the county records office that I had secured just 2 days prior. I told her that she should read the third paragraph very carefully, the part where Grandmother Eleanor Thorne explicitly stated that the land and the structure upon it were never to be sold or transferred by her children, but were to be held in a private trust for the first of her grandchildren, to prove their worth through independent success. I watched as her eyes darted across the page, her fingers trembling so violently that the paper made a dry, rattling sound in the silence of the kitchen. She tried to say that it was a mistake, that the document was outdated, but the legal reality was as solid as the oak floors beneath our feet. I told her that while I appreciated them giving me the keys to a ruin, they had actually handed me the keys to my own inheritance without even realizing it. The house was mine, the land was mine, and for the first time in 28 years, their power over me was absolutely gone. My mother stood there, the yellowed trust deed trembling in her hand like a dying leaf, her face a pale mask of shock and growing desperation. She looked from the document to the beautiful white walls of the kitchen, then back to me, her voice suddenly losing its sharp edge and becoming something much more dangerous, a soft and manipulative whisper. "Maya," she said, "you have to understand that this was a misunderstanding, a simple error in our family records, and surely you would not use a technicality to hurt your own sister." She tried to step closer, to put a hand on my shoulder, but I stepped back, maintaining a distance that felt as wide as the ocean. I told her that for 28 years, I had been the daughter who understood, the daughter who sacrificed, and the daughter who absorbed every blow so that Genevieve could shine. But that Maya was gone, buried under the 400 hours of labor and the $12,000 I had poured into this soil. I looked over at Genevieve, who was still frozen on her suitcase, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, as the movers stood awkwardly in the background. I told them both that this was no longer a conversation about family loyalty, but a matter of legal trespassing. I gave Genevieve exactly 60 minutes to have the movers put every single one of her designer boxes back into that yellow truck and to leave my property forever. My mother started to protest, mentioning my father's temper and the family's reputation, but I simply pointed to the door. I told her that if they were not gone by the time the sun touched the horizon, I would be calling the local sheriff to enforce the terms of my grandmother's trust. The power had shifted, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the keys and the authority. Genevieve began to wail, a high-pitched and frantic sound that echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the living room I had painstakingly restored with my own hands. She looked at our mother, clearly expecting a miracle or another manipulative trick, but for once the woman who had always smoothed over her every mistake stood silent and utterly defeated. The movers, sensing the sudden shift in authority and fearing any potential legal repercussions, did not wait for further instructions from Genevieve or my mother. They began to haul the heavy plastic-wrapped furniture back toward the massive yellow truck, their heavy boots thumping rhythmically on the porch I had sanded until my fingers bled. My mother tried one last time to reach me, her voice trembling with a mixture of cold anger and a desperate kind of pride she had never shown me before. She told me that I was being cruel to my own blood, and that my father would never forgive me for this public humiliation. I stood by the door with my arms crossed, watching the clock on the wall that I had hung just 2 days ago. I told her that forgiveness was a luxury I could no longer afford, and that my father's opinion had lost all its currency the moment he handed me the keys to a ruin and expected me to be grateful for the dirt. I watched as they scrambled to gather their remaining belongings, the designer lamps and the silk rugs being shoved back into boxes, with none of the care they had arrived with. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged tree line of Clear Creek, casting a deep orange glow over the garden I had planted, the moving truck finally roared to life. Genevieve did not look back. She simply climbed into her white convertible and sped away, leaving a thick cloud of dust in her wake. My mother followed slowly, her expensive car disappearing down the gravel road until the only sound left was the peaceful evening song of the crickets. I walked back inside and locked the door, the heavy bolt clicking into place with a finality that felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter. I was alone, but for the first time in 28 years, I was truly home. The silence that followed the departure of the moving truck was not empty. It was a heavy breathing presence that seemed to fill every corner of the Thorne property with a newfound sense of peace. I stood in the center of the living room, the moonlight spilling across the oak floors I had sanded for over 80 hours, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I was truly the master of my own surroundings. For 28 years, I had been waiting for someone to criticize my choices or demand that I move aside to accommodate Genevieve's endless needs. But that cycle of sacrifice had finally been broken. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cold glass of water, the liquid feeling sharp and refreshing against the lingering heat of the confrontation. I pulled the yellow trust deed from my pocket once more, the paper feeling like a sacred shield in the dim light of the evening. My grandmother, Eleanor Thorne, had clearly known exactly what she was doing when she drafted those specific legal clauses in 1992. She had witnessed the subtle shifts in the family dynamic even back then, and she had placed this land into a protective trust to ensure that the Thorne legacy would only go to the grandchild willing to prove their worth through independent labor and resilience. I thought about the $12,000 I had spent, every single cent earned through late nights and early mornings at my accounting firm, and I felt a surge of pride that was entirely untainted by the need for my parents' approval. I had not just saved a house from ruin. I had saved myself from a lifetime of being the invisible daughter who existed only to serve. Tomorrow, I would contact a specialist lawyer to solidify the legal boundaries and change the locks on every door. But tonight, I would sleep in the bedroom I had built with my own 2 hands. The air smelled of fresh paint and lavender, the scent of a new beginning that belonged entirely to Maya Thorne. No. The following Monday morning was spent in a quiet, glass-walled office in the city, a place far removed from the dusty fields of Clear Creek, but deeply connected to its future. I sat across from a real estate attorney, presenting him with the brittle, yellowed pages of my grandmother Eleanor Thorne's trust deed. He spent 30 minutes reviewing the documents in silence, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine surprise as he realized the magnitude of my parents' oversight. He confirmed that the legal language was ironclad, and that my parents had never possessed the authority to promise the property to Genevieve or anyone else. While I was signing the final paperwork to officially update the deed in my name, my phone began to vibrate incessantly on the mahogany desk. It was my father. I took a deep breath, nodded to the lawyer, and stepped out into the hallway to answer the call. His voice was not the calm, measured tone I had grown up with. It was a storm of righteous indignation and cold fury. He called me ungrateful and accused me of stealing from my own sister, demanding that I tear up whatever nonsense papers I had found and apologize to my mother immediately for the humiliation I had caused. I stood my ground, my voice steady and devoid of the old fear that used to paralyze me. I told him that I was not stealing anything, but simply claiming what our grandmother had intended for the grandchild, who was willing to prove their worth through labor. I informed him that I had already changed every lock on the property, and that any attempt to enter without my written permission would be treated as criminal trespassing. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. He told me that I was no longer a part of the Thorne family, and that I should never expect a single penny or a moment of support from them again. I closed my eyes, felt the weight of my own house keys in my pocket, and told him that was a price I was more than willing to pay for my freedom. The first week of my absolute independence began with a silence that was both terrifying and incredibly beautiful. For the first time in 28 years, the heavy weight of my father's expectations and my mother's constant criticism had been lifted from my shoulders, leaving me with a lightness I had never known. I spent my mornings on the porch, watching the sun rise over the Clear Creek hills, while drinking coffee from a mug that was not part of a matched set from the mahogany table. On Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Miller walked across the road, carrying a weathered wooden box that looked as ancient as the house itself. He sat with me on the steps and opened the lid to reveal a collection of black and white photographs of my grandmother, Eleanor Thorne, when she was a young woman. In the photos, she was standing in front of this very house, her hands stained with dirt and her eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising spirit. Mr. Miller told me that Eleanor had built this place during a time when everyone told her a woman could not manage such a task alone, and he said that seeing me on that ladder for 400 hours reminded him of her strength. He handed me an old silver locket that he had been keeping for 30 years, a gift Eleanor had left for the grandchild who would eventually bring the Thorne property back to life. As I held the cool metal in my hand, I realized that my parents had not just given me a ruin. They had unknowingly led me back to the only person who had ever truly understood my worth. I was not the discarded daughter. I was the chosen successor. I looked at the gravel road where my family had vanished, and I felt no regret. I was busy building a life that was finally and completely my own. The news of the Thorne family dispute spread through the small community of Clear Creek like a wildfire in a dry summer, and people who had previously looked at me with pity now stopped by with baskets of fresh vegetables or offers to help with the heavy lifting I still had left to do. I realized that by standing my ground against my parents and Genevieve, I had earned a type of respect that I could never have found at that mahogany dining table in the city. One evening, a black car pulled up to the gate, and for a moment, my heart tightened with the familiar dread of another confrontation. But it was not my father or my mother. It was an old associate of my grandmother, Eleanor, a man who had known about the trust for decades, but had been sworn to silence until the rightful heir claimed the property. He handed me a leather-bound ledger that contained the financial history of the land, and a small handwritten note from Eleanor herself. The note said that she knew the path would be difficult, and that my own family might become the greatest obstacle to my happiness. She wrote that the house was not just a structure, but a test of character, and that she was proud of the woman I had become before I had even reached the age of 28. I sat on the porch and read those words over and over, feeling a deep sense of connection that bypassed the toxic dynamics of my immediate family. I had spent $12,000 of my savings, but the wealth I was discovering in these old pages was worth far more than any luxury apartment in the city. I was no longer the daughter who was defined by her sister's success. I was the guardian of a history that was finally safe in my hands, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the legacy I had fought so hard to protect. The whispers from the city began to reach Clear Creek through the cold blue light of my phone screen. Genevieve's perfect life, the one my parents had sacrificed my dignity to build, was starting to show deep and ugly cracks. A mutual friend from the law firm sent me a message one rainy Tuesday evening, mentioning that the prestigious apartment downtown had become a nightmare of endless construction noise and failing infrastructure. Apparently, the luxury building had been rushed into completion, and now the residents were dealing with black mold and pipes that groaned like dying animals in the middle of the night. Genevieve, who had never known how to handle a single inconvenience without our mother's intervention, was reportedly in a state of constant and fragile hysteria. Even more satisfying was the news that her performance at the firm was being questioned. Without me there to quietly double-check her files and fix her late-night errors, her lack of actual grit was becoming impossible to hide. Hi. My mother had called me 6 times in 2 days, her messages transitioning from angry demands to desperate pleas for me to just talk to her. But I kept my phone on silent. I sat on my porch listening to the peaceful rustle of the oak trees, and I realized that the gilded cage they had chosen for her was finally falling apart. They had tried to steal my sanctuary because Genevieve's paradise was a lie. But the trust deed in my drawer was a truth that no amount of family guilt could ever erase. I was no longer the safety net for her failures. And for the first time in 28 years, I let the silence of the country wash over me, without a single ounce of regret. One crisp morning in early October, a professional photographer from a prominent regional home and garden magazine pulled into my driveway. He had heard whispers at the local hardware store about a remarkable restoration project in Clear Creek that had turned a dangerous ruin into a modern masterpiece. He spent 3 hours capturing the way the autumn light danced across the oak floors I had sanded until my back felt broken, and the way the soft white walls seemed to glow with a life of their own. He told me that my eye for detail was extraordinary, and that I possessed a rare talent for preserving the original soul of a structure while giving it a new purpose. As he was leaving, he handed me a professional card and mentioned that several high-end interior designers in the city would pay a premium for a consultant with my specific grit and vision. This was the validation I had never received at the mahogany dining table. A complete stranger saw the immense value in the labor that my own parents had tried to dismiss as a minor hobby. That same afternoon, a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox, containing an invitation to a formal dinner at my father's private club. Inside was a handwritten note from my mother, written in her perfect, flowing script, claiming that the family was willing to overlook my past behavior and welcome me back into the fold. She spoke of reconciliation and family unity, but I saw the words for what they truly were: a desperate attempt to regain control now that Genevieve's luxury life was crumbling around her. I did not write back. I simply placed the invitation on the marble counter next to the photographer's card and felt a wave of cold, sharp certainty. My worth was no longer a subject for family debate or a bargaining chip for their comfort. I was a creator, a legal owner, and a woman who had finally learned that silence is often the most powerful answer of all. I arrived at the private club exactly on time, not out of a sense of duty, but because I wanted this to be the final chapter of a story they thought they were still writing. The grand dining room smelled of expensive cigars and old money, a world that had always made me feel like an invisible outsider in my own skin. My father was already seated at the head of a long table that looked remarkably like the mahogany one from my childhood, his expression carefully neutral and commanding. Genevieve sat to his right, her eyes red from hours of crying, looking like a shattered porcelain doll who had lost her favorite toy. My mother began to speak immediately, her voice dripping with a forced warmth that made my skin crawl with an old familiar dread. She spoke of the upcoming magazine feature as if it were a shared family triumph, suggesting that my newfound success could be the perfect solution for Genevieve's current housing crisis. I waited until she was finished. Then I placed my grandmother Eleanor's original silver locket on the table between us. I told them that for 28 years, I had believed that love meant making myself small so that they could feel large. I told them that I finally understood that boundaries are not punishments, but doors that I alone have the power to guard. I looked at my father and informed him that the legal trust was active and immutable, and that any further attempts to manipulate the ownership of Clear Creek would be met with immediate legal action. I told Genevieve that she was 28 years old, and it was high time she learned how to build something of her own instead of trying to inhabit the ruins of my life. I stood up, refusing to eat a single bite of their guilt, and walked out into the cool night air. I was no longer a shadow in their house. I was the light in my own. The magazine feature, titled The Resurrection of Clear Creek, was published exactly 3 weeks after that final dinner at the private club, and the response was more overwhelming than I ever could have imagined. I received a phone call from a senior architect in the city who wanted to hire me as a consultant for a historic renovation project worth over $500,000, proving that my 400 hours of labor were far more valuable than a simple hobby. Meanwhile, the silence from the Thorne family was absolute, a cold and heavy void that I finally welcomed as a form of peace. My mother had stopped calling, and my father had stopped sending his formal, threatening emails, as they were both too busy dealing with the public fallout of Genevieve's failed downtown lifestyle. Genevieve had been forced to move back into her childhood bedroom because her expensive apartment was officially condemned by the city inspectors due to structural negligence and a massive failure of the plumbing system. She was living under the same mahogany table where she had once mocked my rusty keys, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. I spent my days in the garden of Clear Creek, tending to the native flowers that were finally beginning to take root in the soil Eleanor Thorne had left for me. I realized that my grandmother had not just left me a property. She had left me a blueprint for a life built on truth instead of appearance. Every time I looked at the polished white walls of my home, I was reminded that I did not owe anyone a version of myself that made them comfortable at the cost of my own soul. I was finally Maya Thorne, a woman who had built her own sanctuary out of a ruin, and I was no longer afraid of the shadows they tried to cast over my name. I spent 28 years being the easy daughter, the one who folds under pressure, and the one who absorbs every bitter blow just to keep the family intact. I told myself for a long time that my constant sacrifice was a form of love, but standing here in the quiet hallway of my own home, I finally realized the truth. Keeping the peace at the mahogany table was never the same as actually being at peace. It was just a prettier name for a long and suffocating silence. I will not tell you exactly what to do with your own family, for I do not know your specific story, or the way your own version of Genevieve has learned to make you feel small. But I will tell you 3 things I wish someone had told me when I first held those rusty keys. First, boundaries are not a form of punishment. They are not walls that you build to hurt people or to keep the world out. They are doors, and you are the only person who gets to decide who is worthy enough to walk through them. My grandmother, Eleanor Thorne, whispered to me, when I was only 9 years old, that my hands knew things my head had not figured out yet. I am only now understanding that she meant the physical act of building something will eventually build the strength within your soul. Sometimes you truly have to start the work before you believe you are capable of finishing it. And the last lesson, which is the hardest one to swallow, is this. You do not owe anyone a version of yourself that makes their life more comfortable at the cost of your own. That is the greatest truth the ruin taught me. As I look at the garden I planted with my own 2 hands, I know that I am finally, and forever, enough. The first frost of November arrived silently, silvering the edges of the garden I had so carefully nurtured throughout the long hot summer. I stood by the window of the master bedroom, watching the early morning light catch the crystalline patterns on the glass, and I realized that the house had become more than just a shelter. It was now a living testament to my own survival. The letters started arriving shortly after the magazine feature went national, hundreds of them, filled with stories from women who had also spent their lives sitting at mahogany tables that were too large for their voices. They wrote about their own versions of Genevieve, their own silent sacrifices, and how seeing the photographs of a ruin turned into a sanctuary gave them the courage to stop being small. I spent 48 hours reading every single word, my heart aching with a shared history I never knew I possessed, and I decided to transform the old carriage house into a workspace for my new consulting business. My parents had tried to give me a burden, but they had accidentally provided the foundation for a movement that was already growing beyond the borders of Clear Creek. I did not feel the old, hollow need for their approval anymore, because the validation of 300 strangers was far more honest than the hollow praise of a family that only loved my utility. I picked up my grandmother Eleanor Thorne's old silver pen and began to sketch the blueprints for a life that was finally, and beautifully, out of their reach. The transformation was complete, not just of the wood and the stone, but of the woman who stood within them. And for the first time in 28 years, I knew that the roots I had planted would never be torn away. December arrived with a heavy blanket of snow that turned Clear Creek into a silent white world. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat against the frosted window. A courier delivered a package with no return address, just my name, Maya Thorne, written in a shaky, familiar hand that I recognized as that of my father. Inside, I found a small leather journal that had belonged to my mother. Its pages were filled with years of secret financial ledgers and desperate notes. It became clear that they had not just favored Genevieve because she was the chosen one. They had used every resource of the family estate to fuel her expensive lifestyle because they were terrified of appearing anything less than perfect to their social circle. They had treated me as a utility because I was the only one who did not require a constant investment of their dwindling pride. I spent 5 hours reading through the calculations, seeing exactly how they had diverted funds that Eleanor Thorne had intended for the maintenance of this very house. The betrayal was complete, documented in black ink and cold numbers. Yet I did not feel the old, familiar sting of anger. Instead, I felt a profound sense of relief, because the truth was finally laid bare in my hands, and it confirmed that my exile to this ruin was the greatest gift they could have ever unintentionally given me. I walked over to the fireplace, the warmth of the crackling wood reaching my face, and I realized that the mahogany table in the city was built on a foundation of lies and debt. I placed the journal on the shelf next to the silver locket of my grandmother, a reminder of the difference between a house made of money and a home made of truth. I was 30 years old now in my heart, and as the snow continued to fall, I knew that the storm outside could never reach the peace I had built within these white walls. The first signs of spring began to emerge from the thawing earth of Clear Creek. As the pale green shoots of the daffodils I had planted during the autumn finally broke through the softened soil, I spent my mornings in the old carriage house, which I had successfully converted into a bright, airy studio for my architectural consulting business, surrounded by blueprints and samples of reclaimed timber. My first major client was a young couple from 3 towns over, who had heard my story and wanted me to help them breathe new life into a 19th century farmhouse they had recently purchased. It felt like a full circle moment as I shared the lessons I had learned from the dust and the rot of my own sanctuary, showing them that a home is built with patience and respect rather than just luxury materials. On a Tuesday afternoon, a single handwritten letter arrived from Genevieve. It was her first communication in over 4 months, and the ink was blurred as if by tears or perhaps just a lack of her usual expensive stationery. She wrote that our parents were considering selling the family estate in the city to cover their mounting debts, and she asked if there was any room for her in Clear Creek, even just as an assistant in my studio. I looked out the window at the vibrant garden and the sturdy white walls of the house that had once been a ruin, and I felt a profound sense of closure that did not require a single word of reply. I did not feel the need to punish her, but I also knew that I could not allow the toxicity of my past to contaminate the sanctuary of my future. I placed the letter in the recycle bin and returned to my drawings, focusing on the intricate details of a staircase that would eventually lead someone else toward their own freedom. I was no longer the daughter of the Thorne family. I was simply Maya Thorne, the woman who had built her own life from the ground up, and for the first time, the horizon looked absolutely limitless. June arrived with a warmth that seemed to soak directly into the old oak floorboards of the kitchen, making the whole house smell of sun, warmed wood, and the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine I had planted near the porch. I decided to host a small, informal open house for the local community of Clear Creek, inviting exactly 15 people who had expressed a genuine interest in the process of historical restoration. I spent 48 hours preparing the space, cleaning the large windows until they sparkled like diamonds, and setting out the original blueprints I had recovered from the attic for everyone to see. Among the guests was a young woman named Sarah, who had recently inherited a small cottage 2 miles down the road that was in a state of advanced decay. She looked at the polished surfaces and the sturdy walls of my home with a mixture of awe and a very familiar kind of fear. The same fear I had felt when I first stepped over the threshold of this ruin 1 year ago. I took her hand and told her that the most important tool she would ever own was not a hammer or a saw, but her own unwavering belief in the value of her labor. I explained that for every hour of physical work I had put into these walls, I had gained 2 hours of spiritual freedom that my parents and Genevieve could never understand. We sat on the porch and drank iced tea while the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, and I realized that I was no longer just a resident of this town. I was a teacher of resilience. My family in the city was likely still struggling with their crumbling appearances, but here, under the vast and open sky, I was building a community that was based on sweat and truth. It was the most satisfying day of my 30 years on this earth, because I finally knew that the house was not just a home for me, but a beacon of hope for anyone else who had been told they were not enough. The first winds of October swept through the valley of Clear Creek, carrying with them the crisp promise of change and the scent of wood smoke from the chimneys of the neighbors I had come to know. I stood by the mailbox at the end of the long gravel driveway, my fingers brushing against the cold metal as I held a thick, cream-colored envelope from the State Historical Preservation Board. They were offering me a contract to oversee the restoration of 3 abandoned estates in the Northern District. A massive project that would require me to travel and to expand the philosophy of resilience I had cultivated within these 4 walls. I looked back at the house, glowing softly under the amber light of the setting sun, and I realized that my work here was not a tether that bound me to one spot, but a launch pad for a future I had never dared to imagine. I thought of my parents and Genevieve in their crumbling apartment, trapped by their own refusal to embrace the truth of labor, and I felt a quiet detachment that was neither angry nor sad, just a simple acknowledgement of 2 different paths diverging in the woods. I walked back up the porch steps and sat in the rocking chair that Mr. Miller had helped me repair, listening to the wind whisper through the ancient oak trees that Eleanor Thorne had loved so dearly. I did not know if I would accept the contract immediately or if I would spend another winter here in the sanctuary of my own making. But the choice was finally and entirely mine to make. The road ahead was wide and unwritten, stretching out into a world that was no longer frightening but filled with the potential for new creations. I picked up my sketchbook and turned to a fresh, blank page, ready to draw the first lines of a life that had no ceiling and no walls to contain it.